It was close to Christmas because my family, we already had the tree up. It was there in the living room, lit in the corner. And I was putting plates out on the dining room table. We were getting ready to have dinner when the phone rang. Well, my father answered the phone in the kitchen, and he spoke to the phone just a little bit. And then he covered the receiver, spoke to my mom, and then he spoke back into the phone. Then he hung up, got his coat, got his car keys, and he left. And my mom, she poked her head in the dining room and she said, "Set another seat at the table. We're going to have company." And then she went and checked the guest room. Well, my father showed up a little while later with this old man. And this old man, he had this tweed hat on with a bright blue feather on the side, and he took off his hat as he stepped into the house. And my father introduced this man as his Uncle Arthur. It was my father's father's brother. And Uncle Arthur, he was tall and thin, but he had broad shoulders. And then he was wearing an overcoat, and then a tweed blazer, and a knit vest, button-down shirt, a tie. His pants were pressed, and his shoes, they were highly polished, but very worn. And Uncle Arthur stepped forward to shake the hand of my mother, my brothers, and me. And as I shook his hands, I noticed his hands were huge, and they felt like soft, thick leather. And my father had Uncle Arthur's suitcase, and this bag looked like it had gone around the world 100 times. And my father gave it to me to put in the guest room, and when I picked it up, it hardly weighed anything. So my family, we sat down to dinner, my family and this unexpected traveler. And it turns out Uncle Arthur, he had been on his way to Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. And to get there, you take a ferry from the town that my family was living in. But Uncle Arthur's bus got in after the last ferry had left, and he knew my father lived in town, so he called, needing a place to stay. And my father, he had grown up in Victoria, British Columbia, and he had this memory of meeting Uncle Arthur when he was just a small boy. And then as the years had passed and life had taken them in various directions, somehow Uncle Arthur and my dad, they always kept sort of track of one another. You know how that happens in families. So as we're sitting there at the table, my father and my mother, they're asking Uncle Arthur about what it was like when his family moved from England to Canada. And then as they were talking, my father said, "Well, Arthur, last I heard you were mining in India?" And Uncle Arthur said, "Oh, well, yes, India. A bit of time in South Africa, but actually most of my time was spent in Australia." And my father said, "Well, Arthur, how did you get into mining?" And he said, "Oh, well, let's just say that I had the help of a most unusual investor. It's been a good life, digging around in dirt, always seeking treasure." And my brothers and I were like, "Ooh." And then Uncle Arthur turned to me and he said, "So, what do you do for a living?" I was 8 years old. I said, "I go to school." He said, it's good to be smart, but it's also good to be lucky." Well, after dinner, we went and sat by the fireplace. My father made a big fire, and my brothers and I, we got hot chocolate. And Uncle Arthur, he had tea with milk and sugar. And he pulled out a pipe. He didn't light it, but he held the pipe in his teeth, and I could smell that sweet scent of pipe tobacco. And I remembered the fire and the glow of the Christmas tree lights behind Uncle Arthur. And there was a moment when he turned and he looked at the tree, and then he turned back and he looked at the fire, and then he said, "I should have brought gifts for the children." And my two brothers, who were a little older, they were a little bbit more polite and they were like, oh, no, really, but I was thinking, well, yeah. Well, then Uncle Arthur got up and he went to the guest room for a moment. He came back, sat down in his chair, and then he began telling this story. He said, I never did get much school growing up, but I learned early on that I could make a good living, with my hands and my strong back. Well, Uncle Arthur had learned that there was a fortune to be made mining copper in Australia. So he was working to get together a grub stake to go to Australia, and he did any job that he could. He worked for the railroad, he dug ditches, and he found himself working on this farm in Saskatchewan, out on the Canadian prairies. He said, I didn't know nothing about farming, but I could fix a machine. And I could tell a group of blokes what to do. So pretty soon I got myself promoted to manager. Now the farm belonged to this man named Henri Dubois. And Dubois had bought the farm about 10 years before, and nobody really knew that much about Dubois. And the farm, it had wheat fields, and it had some fruit trees, and it probably broke even. It wasn't really a money-generating farm, but Dubois never lacked money. And he made a point to always spend money, kind of spread it around in the region, so nobody asked too many questions. Oh, now there were all sorts of theories. There were some who said he robbed a train in the States. And there were some who said he stole crown jewels in Europe. Either way, he was an old pirate. And he had a scar on his face that went from here to here. Well, at the end of the harvest season, when all the hands were let go, Dubois asked Uncle Arthur if he would stay on to make sure that the equipment was ready for the next season. So there was Uncle Arthur living in this bunkhouse on the property. It was a drafty old building. It had a really inefficient wood stove. And by December, this chill had fallen over the land. And the rhythm was that every morning, Uncle Arthur would get up and he would crunch through the snow up to Dubois' house. And then he would have a conversation with Dubois about the work that needed to happen, and then he would go out in the barn and work for the rest of the day. Well, on this one December day, Uncle Arthur was crunching up through the snow toward Dubois' house, and he noticed that there was no smoke coming from the chimney, which was unusual. So when he got to the house, he knocked on the door. No answer. So he opened the door, and he called out, "Hello?" No answer. He stepped inside, called out again, "Hello?" Began walking room to room. "Hello? Hello?" No answer. He walked up the stairs, and then he peered around the corner into Dubois' bedroom. And that is when he saw Dubois dead in bed. So Uncle Arthur called the constable. Constable came out with the coroner. The coroner looked over Uncle Arthur and declared that he had died of natural causes. There was no reason to suspect foul play. But then the question was, who should they notify? Did he have a next of kin? So the constable led them on a search of the house. They were looking for any sort of paperwork, anything that would indicate who to contact. But while they were at it, they looked for treasure. But they found nothing. And so it appeared that I was out of a job, because I didn't have nobody to work for. So they told me I had to clear out the next day. Fine by me. Well, at the end of the day, the constable and the coroner took away Dubois' body, and there was Uncle Arthur in the bunkhouse. Now, this wind was whipping up, and Uncle Arthur was trying to build a fire, and it was so cold. And that's when it occurred to Uncle Arthur, Why should I stay down in this drafty old bunkhouse? Just me and the mice. Why not go up to the boss's house and sleep right smart? So Uncle Arthur went up to Dubois' house and let himself in. Now, this house was not a fancy house, but it was comfortable. And in the living room, above the fireplace, above the mantelpiece, there was a beautiful painting of the Horn of Plenty. So Uncle Arthur built this large fire in the fireplace, and then he pushed up the sofa. Wasn't going to sleep upstairs in his bed, him having died up there and everything. So Uncle Arthur stretched out on that sofa and fell asleep. Well, he woke up in the middle of the night, and he saw, standing there at the end of the sofa, there was a man, a ghost of a man who had a scar on his face that went from here to here. We kids went, "Oh, Dubois!" Indeed, I was petrified. I couldn't move a muscle. But the ghost was not looking at Uncle Arthur. The ghost was looking above the mantelpiece at the Horn of Plenty, and the ghost was saying, "They don't have it. They haven't found it. They can't find it. It's mine." And then all of a sudden the ghost just was gone. The next thing Uncle Arthur knew, he was waking up on the sofa, and there was a dim, wintry light coming in through the windows. Now that wind had really picked up, and snow was coming down, and that dry snow was just being blown all around. It was all Uncle Arthur could do to make it from Dubois' house back to the bunkhouse. He wasn't going anywhere that day. And he spent the rest of the day stuffing wood into that very inefficient wood stove, trying to stay warm. Well, it was after darkness fell that the storm blew itself out. And there was a full moon, and as that moon rose, it was shining down on that fresh snow. The whole world was illuminated. And Uncle Arthur stepped outside to get more wood, and that is when he heard sounds coming from Dubois' house. There were voices and crashes. Voices were crying out, "You will not have it, it's not yours!" And then there'd be this crash, and it would be, "Give it to me, you black buzzard!" And then be another crash. And so Uncle Arthur ran as quickly as he could up toward Dubois' house. And when he got near the living room, he crouched down, went over, peered over the windowsill, and the room was empty. He made his way around to the front of the house. He let himself inside. Not a sound. He thought, well, maybe they've run out the back door, so he made his way to the back door. But when he looked out, there was just a field of fresh snow, unbroken by human footprints. Uncle Arthur turned toward the interior of the house. Now that moonlight was so bright. It was shining in through the windows. It illuminated everything in that house. And as Uncle Arthur moved from room to room for the sight of what sounded like a tremendous fight, nothing was out of place except the painting of the Horn of Plenty. The wire had broken on the back of the painting, but it was still hung up on the nail, so the painting was hanging cattywampus. A corner of it was resting on the mantelpiece. And this allowed Uncle Arthur to see the whole. He took the painting off the wall, and sure enough, there was a hole in the wall, a cavity. And in that cavity, there was a sack with coins spilling out of the top. And Uncle Arthur reached up and took down that sack. It was heavy, but he was a strong man back then. And he carried that sack of coins over to the window, and in the moonlight he examined one of those coins. And even in that poor light, I could tell this was gold. And just then, Uncle Arthur felt this icy breeze, and he looked up, and there was Dubois holding a knife, and Dubois slashed at him, and Uncle Arthur jumped back. And for a ghostly blade, it felt real enough as it whistled past my throat. Uncle Arthur grabbed that sack of gold and ran for the door, and the ghost howled. It said, "Stop, it's mine!" And Uncle Arthur ran out onto the porch, and the ghost was right behind him until it got to the door. And the ghost could not pass through the door. It could not pass the threshold. And the ghost howled, and Uncle Arthur, he ran, staggered as fast as he could to that bunkhouse, and he threw that sack of gold into his satchel, and he lit out for town, and he did not stop running until he could hear the ghostly howls no more. He left town the next day on the train, bound for Australia. He had one very heavy bag. And at this point, Uncle Arthur scooched forward on his chair, and he leaned very closely to us kids. And then he said, "So, I have seen a ghost, but I'm lucky. He was a rich one, and he made a right fine business partner. Now, stick out your hands." And so we all held out our hands, and into each one of our palms he pressed an old gold coin. And then he sat back in his chair and he said, "I've still got a few." And he winked. Now I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my own bed. And it turned out Uncle Arthur, he had departed on the first ferry in the early morning, and we never did see him again. And in many ways, his visit was so short. It just felt like a dream. Except for there on my nightstand, there was an old gold coin.